Paris in 1789 was a city of hunger, anger, and restless hope. The Bastille had fallen, and the monarchy was trembling. For ordinary people, it felt as though the future had been reborn, yet it carried with it a shadow darker than the past. The revolution began with promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The tricolour flag flew over the streets, and slogans painted on walls declared the death of tyranny. But in the alleys, whispers spread that liberty itself might soon become another tyrant. Maximilien Robespierre, once a lawyer of conscience, emerged as a figure of incorruptible morality. His voice was sharp, his words unwavering. To his followers, he was the Incorruptible, a man devoted to justice. To his enemies, he was a zealot, willing to drown France in blood. The revolution moved quickly from idealism to paranoia. Aristocrats were stripped of privilege, their lands seized, their lives threatened. Bread riots raged in marketplaces, and the people demanded both food and vengeance. The guillotine, a new machine of equality, promised swift justice. It was Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine who had proposed the device, not as a weapon of terror but as a humane instrument. Every man, noble or peasant, would lose his head in the same manner, cleanly, efficiently, without prolonged suffering. The irony was that this humane invention became the grim symbol of the revolution. At first, the guillotine struck only the powerful. Nobles, courtiers, and priests were paraded to the scaffold, their powdered wigs and velvet coats marked as relics of a dead world. Crowds cheered as heads rolled into baskets, convinced that justice had finally come. Yet the revolution was insatiable. Each execution seemed to demand another, like blood feeding a flame. Suspicion became a form of survival. Neighbors accused neighbors of treason, and whispers carried the weight of death sentences. Robespierre and his Jacobin allies tightened their grip on the new republic. The Committee of Public Safety was formed, a name that carried both protection and menace. Its task was simple: defend the revolution by any means necessary. The streets of Paris transformed into theaters of fear. In taverns, men lowered their voices when politics arose, knowing that a careless word could end at the guillotine. Posters warned against counter-revolutionary sympathies. Even silence became dangerous. Was it loyalty or dissent? By 1792, the revolution had devoured the monarchy itself. King Louis XVI was brought to trial, accused of conspiring against his own people. His defense mattered little. On January 21, 1793, he mounted the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution, his lips trembling as he attempted to speak. The blade fell with a hiss, and the king's head dropped into the basket. A roar of triumph erupted from the crowd, as though centuries of oppression had been cut away in an instant. But beneath the jubilation, a chilling truth lingered. If a king could be killed, no one was safe. Soon after, Queen Marie Antoinette followed. Once a symbol of royal luxury, she now stood gaunt and pale in her final hours. Her last words, apologizing to her executioner for stepping on his foot, seemed tragically human. The crowd jeered as her head fell, the monarchy erased in blood. With the crown destroyed, suspicion turned inward. The revolution's enemies were no longer nobles, but anyone accused of lukewarm enthusiasm. Revolutionaries fought other revolutionaries. Former allies became traitors overnight. The guillotine became the final arbiter of political loyalty. The September massacres of 1792 had already revealed the madness to come. Mobs stormed Parisian prisons, convinced that aristocrats and priests inside were plotting counterattacks. For days, prisoners were hacked to pieces, their bodies left in heaps. Justice no longer came from courts but from the mob's fury. Robespierre watched and calculated. He detested mob violence but embraced the principle: fear could purify the republic. If the people trembled before the guillotine, then they would obey the revolution's vision. Terror was not cruelty. It was, in his words, prompt, severe, inflexible justice. This philosophy bled into daily life. Markets displayed heads on pikes, their faces slack and bloodless. Children watched as if it were theatre, growing up with the guillotine as a constant presence. Death became not an exception but a rhythm, woven into the days of the Republic. The Revolutionary Tribunal was established, a court where trials were swift and evidence often thin. To be accused was nearly to be condemned. Witnesses were unreliable, and defense lawyers could do little. The verdict almost always ended at the guillotine. Ordinary citizens began to feel the weight of terror. A baker who sold bread at too high a price could be called an enemy of the people. A woman who complained about ration lines might be branded a royalist sympathizer. Guilt and innocence blurred until survival depended only on silence and loyalty. By mid-1793, the reign of terror had formally begun. The Committee of Public Safety declared France surrounded by traitors and spies, both within and beyond its borders. Foreign monarchies threatened invasion, while rebellions smoldered in the provinces. In Paris, every whisper carried the echo of the blade. The guillotine's shadow stretched across the nation. Where once it had been a tool of revolution, it now became a tool of intimidation. Robespierre and his allies believed they were cleansing France, purging it of corruption and betrayal. In truth, they were building a nation of fear. Paris woke each day to the drumbeat of executions, the Place de la Révolution filled with crowds, not only to witness justice but to reassure themselves of their own safety. If another head rolled, perhaps theirs would remain intact another day. The revolution had promised liberty, but it was liberty sharpened into a blade. Each drop of blood was justified as the price of freedom, even as the streets ran red. And in the heart of Paris, the guillotine stood tall, waiting for its next victim. The year 1793 darkened like a storm over France. The revolution was no longer about liberty, it was about survival. In Paris, survival meant aligning with Robespierre and the Jacobins, or facing the blade. The Committee of Public Safety ruled with near-absolute authority. Its members sat like judges of fate, drafting decrees that determined who lived and who died. To them, executions were not cruelty, but medicine, cutting out the disease of treason from the body of the Republic. Each morning, the Revolutionary Tribunal opened its doors. The accused were paraded in, often bewildered peasants or merchants who had muttered the wrong words. Their trials lasted minutes, verdicts delivered with the weight of inevitability. The guillotine became the punctuation mark of these trials. Drums rolled as carts carried prisoners to the Place de la Révolution. Crowds gathered, not only to witness justice, but to reassure themselves that they were safe for today. Fear spread beyond the aristocracy. Journalists who criticized Robespierre found their words turned into indictments. Playwrights, school teachers, even children of accused parents faced suspicion. Blood no longer separated noble from commoner. It soaked everyone equally. The revolution's most famous voices turned against one another. Georges Danton, once a fiery ally, began calling for moderation. He argued that France needed bread, not more blood. His charisma swayed many, but Robespierre saw only betrayal. Danton's trial was a spectacle. He thundered in court, mocking his judges, declaring that history would curse their cruelty. Yet his eloquence meant nothing. The guillotine silenced him on April 5, 1794, his head raised before the crowd as proof that mercy was treason. Soon after, Camille Desmoulins followed. A journalist and friend of Robespierre, he had once been the revolution's voice of passion. His pamphlets called for an end to terror, urging forgiveness. That call became his death warrant. His wife pleaded for his life, but the blade answered instead. With each execution, Robespierre grew colder, convinced of his righteousness. He told the convention that terror and virtue were inseparable, that without terror, virtue was powerless. To him, the guillotine was not a weapon, but a tool of moral cleansing. Paris learned to live in whispers. Families avoided discussing politics at dinner. Tavern owners removed paintings of kings, hiding them in basements. Citizens carried revolutionary pamphlets in their pockets as shields, proof of loyalty. Still, suspicion was a noose that could tighten without warning. The streets of Paris reflected this fear. Posters screamed accusations, denouncing neighbors as traitors. Children were taught to inform on parents if they spoke ill of the Republic. Trust disintegrated. Betrayal became a currency of survival. The guillotine's rhythm was relentless. Carts rattled down cobblestones each day, loaded with the condemned. Some prisoners cried, others prayed, a few laughed with defiance, but all faced the same steel kiss of the blade. Spectacle became routine. Women sold refreshments near the scaffold. Artists sketched the faces of the condemned. Gossip swirled about the expressions of the dying. Was the king brave? Did the queen tremble? The line between justice and theatre blurred completely. In the provinces, terror was even harsher. Lyon, accused of counter-revolution, faced mass executions. Cannons and muskets slaughtered prisoners by the hundreds. In Nantes, rebels were tied to barges and drowned in the Loire River, their corpses drifting to the surface like grim testimony. The revolution justified this cruelty as necessity. France was at war with Austria, Prussia, and Britain. Armies pressed against its borders. Robespierre claimed the Republic could not fight enemies abroad while tolerating traitors within. Every head severed in Paris was a shield against foreign invaders. Ordinary people felt the contradiction deeply. They marched to the scaffold chanting liberty, equality, fraternity, even as liberty was strangled by fear. Each execution promised safety, yet each left the nation weaker, hungrier, more divided. The revolutionary calendar itself tried to erase the old world. Months were renamed, Sundays abolished, churches desecrated, priests were executed or forced to renounce their faith. To many, it felt as if not only monarchy, but God himself had been guillotined. Yet Robespierre clung to virtue. He spoke of building a republic of moral purity, where corruption was impossible and every citizen was equal. But his purity was sharp as steel, and it left no room for dissent. The guillotine became so busy that it wore down. Its grooves grew slick with blood, its blade dulling from constant use. Executioners had to stop between sessions to sharpen it, the crowd waiting impatiently for the next act of justice. Historians later counted the deaths, thousands executed in Paris, tens of thousands across France. But in 1794, the numbers mattered less than the atmosphere. It was as though France itself had become one vast prison, where freedom lived only in slogans, while bodies piled at the scaffold. Some citizens still cheered, believing terror was the path to salvation. Others watched in silence, hollow-eyed, clutching children close. All knew that the revolution had become a beast that fed on its own, and that Robespierre held the reins. In the heart of Paris, the guillotine stood not as a temporary machine but as a monument. Its tall wooden frame loomed over the square, its blade catching sunlight like a cruel symbol of justice. For the people of France, it had become the true throne of power. And as spring of 1794 approached, the machine showed no sign of slowing. The revolution had become an executioner, and every heartbeat in France thudded to the rhythm of the falling blade. By the summer of 1794, Paris had become a city of ghosts. The markets were barren, the prisons overflowing, and the air heavy with the scent of blood. The guillotine no longer shocked the people, it numbed them. Robespierre stood at the center of it all, a man both revered and feared. His speeches thundered with visions of virtue, but his eyes betrayed a fanatic's fire. To his followers, he was the guardian of the revolution. To his enemies, he was its tyrant. The Committee of Public Safety now wielded powers once unimaginable. It decided who was suspect, who was guilty, and who would die. Yet even within the committee, cracks appeared. Some feared Robespierre's growing dominance, whispering that he wanted to become a dictator. The festival of the Supreme Being in June 1794 revealed the depth of his ambition. Robespierre led the ceremonies, dressed in sky-blue robes, declaring a new civic religion. He spoke of morality, virtue, and the triumph of justice. But many saw not a prophet, only a man who craved divine authority. Murmurs of dissent grew louder. Deputies in the convention asked themselves, if even Danton and Desmoulins could be guillotined, who among them was safe? Terror had begun devouring its architects, and fear turned into self-preservation. Meanwhile, the executions multiplied. Nobles, priests, peasants, revolutionaries, moderates, radicals, anyone could be condemned. The tribunal worked like clockwork, its judges weary yet relentless. Every day heads fell in batches, the crowd too exhausted to cheer. In July 1794, Robespierre made his most fatal mistake. He delivered a speech accusing unnamed deputies of conspiracy. He refused to reveal names, letting suspicion hang over everyone. The convention chamber bristled with unease. Deputies realized they were all potential victims. That night, men who once feared him gathered in secret. They decided that Robespierre must fall, or they themselves would be dragged to the scaffold. The revolution's Incorruptible had become intolerable. His purity was poison. On July 27, 1794, 9th, Thermidor, Year 2, Robespierre entered the convention to thunderous cries. Instead of reverence, he met hostility. Deputies shouted him down, denouncing him as a tyrant. His attempts to speak were drowned in jeers. The vote was swift. He was arrested. His allies tried to resist. Armed supporters stormed the Hôtel de Ville, where Robespierre and his loyalists barricaded themselves. For one desperate night, Paris held its breath, uncertain whether the Incorruptible would reclaim power or fall beneath it. But the National Guard turned against him. By dawn, Robespierre was captured, his jaw shattered by either a bullet or his own attempt at suicide. Dragged through the streets, he was no longer the stern prophet of virtue, but a broken man, his face bloodied, his voice silenced. The following day, Robespierre and his closest allies were led to the guillotine. The same machine he had praised as the guardian of justice now waited for him. Crowds gathered, not with fear, but with grim satisfaction. One by one, his companions were executed. Saint-Just, the young fanatic who spoke of eternal purity, fell without a word. Couthon, crippled and unable to walk, was carried to the scaffold. Their deaths were the revolution devouring its final zealots. When Robespierre's turn came, silence swept the square. His bandaged jaw muffled his cries as executioners stripped away the cloth. The crowd leaned forward, eager to see if the man who had silenced so many would face silence himself. The blade fell, and Robespierre's head dropped into the basket. A cheer erupted, louder than any that had greeted the deaths of kings or nobles. Paris roared not for liberty, but for relief, the relief that terror might finally end. With Robespierre gone, the reign of terror collapsed almost overnight. The tribunals slowed, the executions dwindled, and prisoners once destined for death were released. The guillotine, still standing, suddenly felt like a relic of madness. The revolution staggered forward, but it was forever changed. The ideals of liberty and equality had been baptized in rivers of blood. France had sought freedom from tyranny, and instead built a tyranny of fear. In the years to come, Napoleon Bonaparte would rise from the ashes, promising order where chaos had reigned. But the memory of the terror lingered like a scar, a warning carved into France's soul. The guillotine remained in use, but never again with such frenzy. It stood as a reminder of the days when justice had been measured by the rhythm of falling steel, and the people had watched their own ideals consume them. Robespierre's name lived on, both cursed and revered. To some he was a martyr of principle, to others a monster cloaked in virtue. History could never agree, for the terror was too vast, too brutal, too human. And so the revolution's dream ended in a slaughterhouse of its own making. Liberty had been promised, but fear had delivered. In Paris, the ghost of the guillotine lingered long after the last blade fell.